Chagiga Daf Dalid has two main discussions. The first is working through the list of individuals in the Mishnah who are specifically mentioned as chayav or pater in the mitzvah of re'iyah, the mitzvah being ola regel, going to the Beis Hamikdash once of 3 times a year. The Gemara will work through who the Mishnah was referring to, what the sources that they are either exempt or obligated in the mitzvah is, and why we need those sources, and we could not have learned it from other sources. The rest of the daf will be Agadita, discussing a number of psukim which Amoraim found to be particularly emotional or heart-wrenching, and why it is so. So let's begin. We've seen in our Mishnah that a tumtum and an androgynous are excluded from the mitzvah of aliyah l'regel. So the Gemara quotes a brisa, which gives the sources for a number of halachos. So it's based off the pasuk describing the mitzvah of aliyah l'regel, which says shalosh pa'amim b'shana yireh kol zuchorcha es pnei ha'adon Hashem. 3 times a year shall be seen all your males the face of the Master Hashem. So kol zuchorcha, that's the phrase we'll focus on. So the Gemara says as follows: if it would only say zachar, that would exclude women. The fact that it says more than that, it says zuchorcha, your males, that is to exclude from the mitzvah a tumtum and an androgynous. Now what are these? Androgynous is one who has both male and female anatomy. A tumtum is one who has neither, not because he doesn't have them, but because they're covered over by a layer of flesh. The difference in halacha is simple. An androgynous is someone who's both masculine and feminine, or possibly a third creation, which is neither of the two. A tumtum is one or the other, we just don't know which one because it's covered. So the Gemara says both are excluded. Now, that's from the phrase zechorcha, the extra chaf. It says kol zechorcha, though, the extra kol, all your males, that's to include even children. The Gemara says. All right, now the Gemara wants to work through these one at a time. The Gemara says, first of all, you have the word zachar to exclude women. Why do you need to exclude women specifically? The mitzvah of aliyah l'regel is a mitzvah sasesha azman grama. It's a positive commandment that can only be done at certain specific times. Women are always excluded from those halachos. The Gemara says, no, I do need the source. I need the source because there is a link between the mitzvah of aliyah l'regel and the mitzvah of hakel. Both have the word re'iyah involved. I may therefore connect the two. Hakel is also a mitzvah sasesha as mangrama, but that is an exception to the rule, and women are obligated in that mitzvah because the Torah specifically there says nashim and nashim betaf. Specifically, it tells us women have to do that. So I may think to connect the two and therefore learn from Hakel that women are also obligated in the mitzvah of aliyah l'regel. Therefore, I need the pasuk to tell me zachar, they are not obligated in aliyah l'regel. Next, we said that zechorcha is to exclude an androgynous, and says I understand why I need that. And we may think that an androgynous is part male, part female, has both male and female aspects to him because he has both anatomy, and therefore his male aspect should be obligated just like all others. Therefore, it comes to tell me, no, an androgynous is not involved in this mitzvah, possibly because it's defining him as being a third sex, not male or female, but something else. Okay, now the Gemara says, though, why do I need a pasuk to tell me that a tumtum, one that I cannot determine his gender, why do I need a pasuk to tell me he's not obligated? If he's a suffix, so I don't know if he's male or female, I would have no reason to say that he's obligated. He might be female and not obligated. Why would I put an obligation upon him? The Gemara says, we're referring to a situation in which there is enough visible from under the flesh to determine that he's male. However, he still has the status of a tumtum. He's still someone who's covered, and therefore he's excluded because of the halacha of zachar. Alright, now the Gemara focuses on the word kol, which is to include children. The Gemara wants to know, how could you tell me that children are obligated in the mitzvah of aliyah l'regel? The Mishnah specifically tells me that children are not obligated. The Gemara says that's true. They're not obligated in midrash, they are obligated in chinuch, though. The Gemara says chinuch is mitzvah derabanan, mitzvah derabanan to educate children in the practice of mitzvahs. That can be what the pasuk is teaching me because the rabbanan aren't from psukim. The Gemara says, you're right, it's not a real mitzvah, it's not a real right? So the pasuk is just a hint. It's not the real, it's not an actual source because it is of rabbinical origin, but the rabbanan often created an asmachta. They found hints to their creations, to their halachos in psukim. The Gemara says, then what is the actual meaning of the word kol? What is it there for? So the Gemara says that it is to exclude someone who cannot go together with everyone else. It's got to be someone who is kol zechorcha. It has to be someone who is part of the entire group. Someone who can't be part of the group is not obligated in the mitzvah of aliyah l'regel. Who is that? Someone who smells particularly badly because of his occupation. So the Gemara lists that would be someone who spends his time collecting excrement of the dogs in order to use it for processing leather. It also excludes someone who is a copper smelter. That's a particularly smelly enterprise. And it also excludes someone who is a tanner who processes leather because he has to work with foul-smelling materials. Now, the Gemara now moves on and refers back to the Mishnah where we had mentioned women and avadim that are not freed. So the Gemara says, I know we already learned the source that women are not obligated in the mitzvah of aliyah l'regel from the word zachar. How do you know that? Avadim are not obligated. So the Gemara says that's because it says that they should appear el penei ha'adon Hashem, refers to Hashem as the adon, the master. And therefore it's only talking to someone who has only one adon. Anybody who has another adon, such as this man who is an eved and therefore has another master, he is not obligated in the mitzvah. The Gemara says again though, why do we need a source? We know that an Eved, this is referring to an Eved Kenani, has the same obligations and chiyuvim as women. Therefore, he should be excluded because it's a mitzvah to say shehazman grama. The Gemara answers that's true. However, well, first we have the source that Avadim have the same halachas as women, and that's because they are both described with the word law. It says in the Psukim v'chasav law, and it says ochu pasa lo nitan la, both describing the ending of one's relationship with a woman and with an eved. So the Gemara now answers and says you're right, for a full-fledged eved we would not need a source. He would be excluded because he has the halacha of women and it's mitzvah to say shezman grama. It's for someone who is part eved and part free man. He is half and half, and he is, therefore we would specifically include him because of the fact that he's partially free. And he's excluded because he has another adon. It's got to be someone who has no adon other than Hashem. Now, the Gemara says, if you look carefully in the wording of the Mishnah, it's obvious that this is what it means, because it refers to him as avadim she'inu mishacharim, slaves who are not freed. Now, if he's an Eved, he's obviously not free. Why do I have to say he's an Eved who's not free? It's referring, therefore, to someone who's an Eved partially and free partially. He's not free, meaning he's not fully free, but he is partially freed. Part Eved and part Ben-Chorin. Therefore, he is excluded. Now, as Rashi points out, later we will change from this halacha and we will say that someone who's part Eved and part free is obligated because his master is obligated to free him, and therefore is considered free already, and he does have to be Ola Regel. But that is a later Mishnah after Beis Hillel changed and held like Bashamai that such a person is obligated to be freed. Okay, now the Gemara moves on, discussing the next phrase in the Mishnah, which is that a lame person, a blind person, a sick person, or an elderly person are not obligated in the mitzvah of Ola Regel. So the Gemara says, how do we learn this? Again, we quote a Brisa. The word regalim, which means feet, that excludes people who have fake legs, people who have wooden legs, or possibly that's excluded from the word pe'amim, as we've seen in the Gemara earlier. And regalim is to exclude the lame, the sick, the blind, and the elderly who cannot walk unaided. Now, it also excludes, the Brisa says, someone who cannot walk on his own 2 feet. Says the Gemara, okay, who's that? Who's that other person that you're referring to? We've already listed everyone. Whereas that's referring to someone who is a mefunik. He's too finicky to walk barefoot, and in the Beis HaMikdash one is not allowed to walk with shoes, and therefore he cannot walk in the Beis HaMikdash. The source he cannot walk with shoes is because it says, Ki sevoyu lera os panai, when you come to be seen by my face, mi bikesh zos mi'etchem ramos chatzerah. This is where Hashem is rejecting Klal Yisrael from Ola Regel, and he's saying, why are you trampling on my courtyard? Why are you trampling on my Beis HaMikdash? That shows we're not allowed to walk with shoes on the Beis HaMikdash. Okay, now the Gemara quotes a Brisa which includes 2 more people that are excluded from the mitzvah of Aliyah L'Regel. That is an RL, somebody who did not have a bris milah because he is not medically cleared for it, or someone who is tameh. So Gemara says, what is the source? So Tameh we understand because we have a link between bringing a carbon into the Beis HaMikdash and actually coming to be Ola Regel. The 2 are linked because you have the end of one pasuk says Uvasa Shama, you should come there, and the other says Vahavesam Shama, you should bring there. So coming and bringing are linked. You can only you're only obligated in the mitzvah of coming, being Ola Regel, if you're also able to do the mitzvah of bringing karbanos. This person is Tameh, cannot. But what about an oral? Somebody who didn't have a bris milah. Why is he not involved in this mitzvah? So Gemara says this is Rabbi Akiva's opinion. Rabbi Akiva holds that an oral counts as a Tameh in a different halachic sugya. Therefore, an oral counts as a Tameh here as well. Where does an oral count as a Tameh? So Rabbi Akiva says in a brisa, in the mitzvah of eating truma, we have a specific exclusion. A tameh is not allowed to eat truma, and we also have the phrase ish repeats the word man twice. It says ish mizer anvu tzarua ozav, but kachem lo yochal. So the phrase ish repeated twice in describing people who are not allowed to eat truma is to include an oral, one who has not had a bris milah, also has the same halacha, is not allowed to eat a truma. Therefore, an oral counts as a tameh, and he's excluded, just like a tameh is, from the mitzvah of aliyah l'regel. Now the Gemara quotes a brisa, which supports some of the things we've said earlier. So it says a tameh is not obligated in the mitzvah of aliyah l'regel, like it says zivasa shamba followed by vahavesim shama. And anybody, therefore, who is involved in the mitzvah of coming to the Beis Hamikdash has got to be also involved in the mitzvah of bringing karbanos. And Rabbi Yochanan ben Dahavai says the name of Rabbi Yehuda, somebody who's blind in one eye is not obligated in the mitzvah of aliyah l'regel because it says liros and it says it's spelled leiraos, or it's pronounced leiraos and spelled liros, to link the one who's coming to seeing HaKadosh Baruch Hu, as it were, and HaKadosh Baruch Hu seeing him when he comes, as it were, that both have to be on equal footing. If he cannot see with both of his eyes, then he's not obligated in being seen by HaKadosh Baruch Hu, meaning he's not obligated in appearing at the Beis Hamikdash. Of course, Hashem can see everyone wherever they are. Alright, now the Gemara discusses a list of psukim that cause an emotional reaction from various Amoraim, beginning with the one which we quoted earlier, Ki sevayu leiros panai mi bikazos meidchem ramaz chatzerai, where Hashem says through the Navi Yeshaya that I'm rejecting you from being Ola Regal. So the Gemara says that this caused Rav Huna to cry whenever he learned this, because he would say, how is it possible, how can it be that someone who is so close to his master, as we were close to Hashem, that he wanted us to come visit him, and his master is longing to see him, and that's why he would say 3 times a year, come to visit me, as it were. Yet he says, oh, I don't want you here. How did we change to be rejected so far and so fast? Rav Huna also cried when he reached the pasuk in Devarim where it says, "V'zavachta shlamim v'achalta sham v'samach lefnei Hashem b'leikacha." You should bring karbanos and shechtim before HaKadosh Baruch Hu. That means HaKadosh Baruch Hu wants to eat at our table, as it were. He wants to be involved in our Suda. Yet later he says in Yeshayahu, Lama li rov zevchechem, why do I need all your karbanos? I don't need any of them. Get rid of them. Okay. Now, Rav Elazar would cry when he reached the pasuk that says, "V'lo yachlo echlov la'anos osoki nivalu mi panav." The brothers, when they found out that the king of Egypt with whom they were speaking was none other than Yosef, were not able to answer him. So he would say, if one is rendered speechless by the rebuke of flesh and blood, imagine how much more speechless we will be rendered by the rebuke of HaKadosh Baruch Hu when we have to give a final and permanent accounting for our mistakes in this world. Rabbi Elazar also used to cry when he got to the pasuk describing when Shmuel was raised by Shaul. Shaul, when he needed to know whether or not to go to war, and the Urim Utum refused to answer him because he had destroyed the city of Kohanim, Shaul had no choice other than to ask a witch to raise the spirit of Shmuel. And when he did so, it says, Vayomer Shmuel el Shaul, Lama hirgastani la'alos, why did you disturb me to bring me up? And that showed that Shmuel was afraid. So the Gemara says that would cause Rabbi Elazar to cry, because he said, look at Shmuel's fear, he was afraid of the din, he was afraid that he was being called to judgment. Therefore, how much more so we must fear the future judgment which we need to face. Now the Gemara says, how do you know that he was afraid? How do you see what he was afraid of here? So the Gemara says, because in the next pasuk it says, "V'tomer ish el shal Elokim ra'isi olim olim," Elokim ra'isi olim. Elohim ra'isi olam, that is, the woman, the witch, said to Shaul, I see great people rising here, plural, but she had only raised Shmuel. So what's the plural? The Gemara says that Shmuel had brought Moshe Rabbeinu along with him, and that is because he had heard he was being called, and he was afraid he was being called to judgment. So he asked Moshe to come along with him to accompany him, because Moshe did not violate any of the mitzvos of the Torah, and therefore he needed or asked for his accompaniment. Now the Gemara says that Rav Ami would cry when he got to the pasuk Yitain ba'afar pihu ulai yesh tikva, should place dirt in his mouth, perhaps there's hope. That means that one should suffer and maybe there'll be hope for an atonement. And he would say all that and it's just a maybe. Similarly, Rav Ami would cry at the verse Bakshu tzedek, Bakshu anava ulai tisteru biyom Hashem, seek justice and humility, perhaps you will be shielded on the day when Hashem reveals his anger. And again, this is perhaps all that work and it's just a maybe. Similarly, Rav Asi would cry when he got to the pasuk Sinu Rav Evu Tov V'Hitzigu B'Shar Mishpat Ulai Yechanan Hashem L'Kei Tzivakos, again saying hate evil, love good, appear before the gate of justice, perhaps Hashem will have mercy. Again, it's just a perhaps, despite all the work that one could do. Now, last one, the Gemara quotes Rav Yosef. He would cry when he got to the pasuk that says V'yesh nisbet below mishpat. There are some who are gathered in, meaning they die without justice. In Mishlei it says one can unjustly be taken from the world before his time. So Gemara has a story here to discuss this. Gemara says that the Gemara asks, is it possible for someone to actually die before his time is up? The Gemara answer is yes. Rav Bibi Bar Abaye used to spend time hanging out with the Malach HaMaves, and he would tell him stories. And one time he related to him that there was an incident that happened, it had happened many years earlier, Tilsef says, where the Malach HaMaves, who has an assistant apparently, sent that assistant to bring him Miriam Magdalah. Now Miriam Magdalah means the one who cares for, or the one who grows, and he had been referring to the one who grows hair, meaning that she braids women's hair. That was her living. Instead, the assistant went and brought him Miriam Magdala Thardiki, the one who raises children. So when he brought her, it was already too late. She had lost her life already, but the Melech HaMavet said, that's not the one I was referring to. I was referring to Miriam Magdala Seir Neshaya. So he said, okay, I'll bring her back to life. He said, no, once she died already, keep her here amongst the dead. And Rav Bivi heard this and he said, how were you able to kill her if it was not her time to go? So the answer was that she had been tending to a fire with a poker stick and it fell on her leg and burned her. That caused her mazel to change. Once her mazel changed, then the Malach HaMaves' assistant was able to get her. Says the Gemara, he asked him, do you have permission to do this? Why are you allowed to take somebody before the right time? So he said, yes, it says, Yesh nisbet below mishpat. There are some who are collected without justice. So he said, what do you mean? Everyone has a set time in this world. It says, Dor halech v'dar va, that one generation does not leave before the other is scheduled to come. So the Gemara answers that the Malach HaMaves answered him, and he said, we'll do something with those extra years. We will pay them back, and that is that this soul who was taken before her time travels the world together with the Malach HaMaves. She's not remanded to the care of the one who cares for the souls of the dead, which is a Malach by the name of Duma. So that doesn't happen until her years are over. But she'll remain around before those years have ended. Somebody says, but what are you going to do with the extra years of life? That's not quite life. What will you do with the extra years of life she was meant to live? And the Malach HaMaves answered, I will give them to a Talmid Chacham who is careful with his words and does not insult people. He will use those years properly.